In the winter of 1901, a small orphanage stood on the edge of Black Hollow, a forgotten stretch of Pennsylvania woodland. Inside its cracked stone walls lived 22 children, all survivors of tragedy. But one cold January night, 12 of them disappeared. No signs of struggle, no footprints in the snow, just empty beds and open windows, and a single word scratched into the wall: returned. For over a century, historians and locals have debated what truly happened inside Black Hollow Orphanage, an event so chilling that even now, the building stands sealed by law, untouched since that night. Black Hollow Orphanage stood like a wound on the landscape, a sprawling, gray stone building half swallowed by the woods of northern Pennsylvania. It was built in 1879 by Margaret Halloway, the widow of a wealthy coal magnate who had lost both her sons in a mining collapse. She called the home her offering of mercy, a place where the forgotten could begin again. But the locals never trusted the structure. It was erected on land long regarded as cursed, the site of an abandoned parish from the mid-1800s, where a small congregation and its preacher had vanished without a trace. Villagers often said the soil there remembered too much. At first, the orphanage served its purpose. A few dozen children lived there under the watch of matrons and a local chaplain. But over the years, misfortune shadowed the place. Illness spread faster than medicine could arrive, and fires seemed to start without cause, burning walls that were never found to be damaged. By the 1890s, the surrounding towns had begun to avoid Black Hollow entirely. Supplies were dropped at the main gate, and only the bravest or most desperate of children were sent there. The building itself began to deteriorate, windows cracking inward, pipes groaning through the night as if the house were breathing. The orphanage's location only deepened its eerie reputation. Black Hollow woods stretched for miles, thick with ash and maple, their branches twisting into strange silhouettes that blotted out the sun. When fog settled in, which was often, it turned the land into a blank, soundless void. Travelers reported that compasses spun wildly near the hollow. Hunters spoke of finding animal carcasses arranged in circular patterns, untouched by scavengers. Some said the ground beneath the orphanage was soft, like something beneath it was moving, shifting just out of sight. To those inside, life followed a rigid, somber rhythm. The children rose at dawn, ate in silence, and were marched to lessons or chores. There was little joy in the air. No laughter echoed through those long corridors, only the shuffle of small feet and the low hum of the wind pressing against the glass. Nights were worse. The woods would come alive with sound. Faint tapping, sometimes whispers that seemed to move from one window to the next. The older children warned the younger ones not to look outside after dark. They said if you stared too long, the trees would stare back. Local folklore claimed the land beneath Black Hollow had once been sacred, or perhaps desecrated, depending on who told the story. Some spoke of an underground chamber, where the vanished congregation had worshipped, conducting midnight rituals they called the return. When the orphanage was built, workers found fragments of old religious carvings in the soil, some depicting figures with missing eyes. They burned the relics, hoping to silence whatever memory lingered there. But fires could not erase what was buried. The building had absorbed something, an unease, a shadow that seemed to move even when no one did. By 1901, the orphanage had become a self-contained world, forgotten by the state, rarely visited by outsiders, and surrounded by silence so thick it felt alive. Eleanor Voss arrived at Black Hollow in the autumn of 1896, stepping from a horse-drawn carriage with only a single suitcase and a folded letter of appointment. She was a thin, pale woman, her dark hair streaked with early gray, her eyes sharp yet distant as though she were always listening to something others could not hear. She spoke softly, almost reverently, as if afraid to disturb the air around her. The children who met her that first day remembered her calm voice, gentle but heavy, like someone carrying invisible grief. Her past was largely a mystery. The record stated she had once worked as a teacher in Philadelphia before a fire destroyed her home, killing her husband and infant daughter. After that, she had vanished from public record for nearly 7 years. When she resurfaced, it was in the quiet town of Black Hollow, applying to oversee an orphanage that few others dared to manage. Some locals whispered that she had been found wandering after the fire, speaking nonsense about voices in the smoke and promises made in flame. Yet her manners were impeccable, her education unquestionable, and the orphanage board, desperate for staff, accepted her without hesitation. From the moment she took charge, the atmosphere within the orphanage changed. The staff described her as disciplined but fair, demanding perfect silence during meals and nightly prayers. She had an obsession with order. Every object had a place, every sound a meaning. But the children, especially the older ones, said she often wandered the halls at night carrying a lantern, whispering names under her breath. When asked, she told them she was praying for the departed souls of the forgotten. Sometimes, however, they swore she was answering someone who whispered back. Eleanor's faith was complex, though she kept a small crucifix above her bed and led hymns every Sunday. She also collected strange symbols and books written in Latin and Old Germanic script. Some of these books were discovered later, containing passages about ritual restitution and the return of the innocent. Villagers who occasionally visited for deliveries claimed her office smelled of burning sage and iron, and that she kept drawings pinned to the wall, circles filled with letters that did not belong to any known alphabet. Despite these peculiarities, she seemed genuinely devoted to the children. She tended to their wounds herself, read them stories by candlelight, and wrote long letters to state officials pleading for better funding. Yet behind her compassion there was a tension, a stillness in her that unsettled even those who trusted her most. It was as though she was waiting for something to begin again. One caretaker later confessed that a few nights before the disappearances, she had awoken to find Eleanor standing in the snow outside, barefoot, gazing into the forest. When asked what she was doing, she replied without turning her head, "They're calling again. It's almost time." Then she walked back inside, leaving no footprints behind. The final week before the disappearances was marked by an unease that settled over the orphanage like a sickness no one could name. It began subtly. The air felt colder even when the fires burned high. The candles seemed to dim faster than they should, and the hallways echoed as though someone else were walking just a few steps behind. The children grew restless, waking from nightmares they couldn't describe, whispering among themselves about shapes they saw in the corners of the dormitory when the lamps went out. One of the youngest girls, Anna, refused to sleep near the window, saying she heard the tapping hands trying to get in. Eleanor Voss noticed the change but said nothing at first. Her journals from that week revealed a woman caught between fear and fascination. She wrote about dreams of a gathering in the woods and the promise of return. Her handwriting, normally precise, had grown erratic. She began to light incense in the corridors each evening, insisting it was for protection. The children said the smoke smelled strange, not like herbs or flowers, but something metallic, almost like burnt coins. The staff, already reduced to just 2 caretakers, started to speak in hushed tones about leaving. One claimed to have seen a boy sitting upright in bed hours after he'd been put to sleep, staring blankly toward the forest. Another swore she heard singing late at night, a low hum that grew louder near the chapel door, though no one was inside. They tried to rationalize it as the wind, but the melody had a pattern, a rhythm that no storm could imitate. By the middle of the week, strange markings began appearing around the orphanage. On the wooden banister, faint carvings of circles and crosses intertwined. On the wall of the cellar, a handprint in soot too large to belong to any child. The caretaker who found it said it was still warm to the touch. When she told Eleanor, the headmistress simply replied, "Do not disturb it. It belongs to them now." The children's behavior grew increasingly strange. They began to gather in groups, whispering to one another in low voices, sometimes laughing without reason, sometimes staring silently at the floor. When questioned, they spoke of the others who visited them in their dreams, children who lived in the forest and promised them freedom. Eleanor seemed both disturbed and intrigued by these confessions. She started keeping certain children close to her, feeding them separately, instructing them in long evening prayers that lasted well past midnight. The night before the tragedy, a violent wind swept through Black Hollow. Windows rattled, doors slammed open and shut as if the house itself were breathing in panic. One of the caretakers fled to town that night, refusing to return. She told villagers the next morning that as she looked back at the orphanage from the road, she saw lights flickering in the forest. 12 of them, spaced evenly apart, glowing like lanterns in the snow. In the days that followed the children's disappearance, the nearby villagers became the reluctant witnesses to a mystery that seemed to unfold beyond human understanding. Black Hollow had always been an isolated place, but after that night, its silence became unnatural, thick, watchful, and alive. Those who lived nearest claimed they could hear faint echoes from the forest, children's laughter, the creak of swings that no longer stood, and sometimes a single voice calling names that belonged to no one they knew. Farmers found their animals refusing to graze near the edge of the trees, staring into the darkness as though something unseen moved there. The first to approach the orphanage after the storm was a man named Jonas Bell, a local carpenter who often repaired the fences around the property. He told others that as he neared the gate, the air grew colder and the world went strangely still. No birds, no rustling leaves, not even the crunch of his own boots in the snow. The front door hung open, creaking slowly, and the faint smell of candle wax and iron drifted out. Inside, he found the beds empty, each sheet folded neatly at the corners and the windows wide open despite the frost crusting the frames. What he couldn't explain was the faint hum that filled the air, a low vibration, almost like a song coming from beneath the floor. By the second day, word had spread through the village. A search party was formed, though few volunteered willingly. The priest, Father Mallory, led them with a cross in one hand and a lantern in the other. As they entered the woods, the temperature dropped sharply, and the snow, which had fallen evenly across the land, showed no footprints leading away from the orphanage. It was as if the children had simply vanished into the air. Yet deep in the forest, where the trees grew older and closer together, the searchers discovered a circle of stones, 12 in total, arranged with eerie precision. In the center, a crude wooden doll was bound to a branch with red thread. The priest ordered it destroyed immediately, but Jonas Bell noticed something carved into the bark of a nearby tree. A name, Eleanor. That night, several villagers claimed to see flickering lights among the trees, moving as if carried by unseen hands. Some said they heard the sound of children singing, soft at first and then rising into the wind before fading again. The next morning, one of the searchers found symbols scratched into the frozen pond behind the orphanage, resembling the same markings carved inside the building, circles intersecting with crosses, spirals that seemed to turn inward endlessly. Even the most rational minds in the village began to fracture under the weight of what they saw. The sheriff who led the investigation left abruptly after a week, refusing to speak about what he had found in the basement, though he reportedly told a friend, it wasn't empty down there. Something was waiting. Within a month, the entire region avoided Black Hollow. No one dared to approach it after sunset, not even the priest, who later confessed that during his final visit, he heard a child's voice whisper in his ear, "We're home now." When investigators finally gained access to the orphanage, what they found inside unsettled even the most hardened men among them. Every room was unnaturally orderly, as though someone had prepared the place for inspection. The beds were made, the chairs aligned, and each child's personal belongings were still in place. Shoes neatly paired, dolls sitting upright on pillows, books left open to the same page. But beneath the surface calm, there was something profoundly wrong. Symbols had been scratched into nearly every wooden surface. Faint circles, spirals, and strange runes that seemed to pulse in the lamplight. On closer inspection, some of the markings appeared to be drawn with ash, others with something darker, something that looked too much like dried blood. The chapel was where the most disturbing discovery awaited. Its walls, once whitewashed and plain, had been repainted in broad strokes of soot, forming a massive ring that enclosed the altar. At its center lay a single open Bible, its pages torn and rearranged, forming phrases that made no sense. The investigators noted that certain verses about resurrection and sacrifice had been underlined repeatedly in red ink. Candles were still standing where they had been placed, their wax pooled on the floor in the shape of small footprints. It looked less like a place of worship and more like a ritual had been performed. In the basement, the air was thick with rot and moisture. There, behind a row of old storage trunks, they found a door hidden behind rotting boards. It led to a narrow stairway descending into the earth. The smell grew stronger as they went down, metallic, damp, and suffocating. At the bottom, in a small stone chamber, they found a circle drawn in chalk surrounded by symbols identical to those carved into the trees outside. In the center of the circle was a wooden box containing 12 small carvings of children, each bearing initials that matched the missing orphans. The figures were arranged in a ring facing inward, their eyes marked with tiny crosses. The most chilling detail was discovered in Eleanor Voss's quarters. Her diary, recovered from a locked drawer, revealed pages of erratic, fragmented writing. She described being visited by voices of the forgotten and spoke of a covenant that required balance to be restored. The last entry, dated the night before the children vanished, read, "May they come tonight to claim what was promised. The forest is waiting. I must open the way." Next to the diary lay a small piece of parchment covered in symbols matching those in the basement, along with a fragment of what appeared to be a child's ribbon. What struck the investigators most was the absence of chaos. There was no evidence of a struggle, no footprints leading away from the building, and no signs of forced entry. It was as though the 12 children had simply ceased to exist, leaving behind only the marks of something ancient, something that had been called, answered, and fulfilled in silence. The official investigation into the Black Hollow disappearance began within 48 hours, though it was clear from the beginning that the authorities were unprepared for what they would encounter. Sheriff Daniel Whitaker, a pragmatic man known for dismissing superstition, took charge of the case. He arrived with a small team of deputies, a few townsmen, and Father Mallory to provide spiritual oversight. At first, Whitaker believed it to be a case of abduction, perhaps a trafficking ring operating under the guise of charity. But as he combed through the orphanage and its surrounding woods, his confidence began to unravel. There were no signs of forced entry, no carriage tracks, no footprints leading away. The heavy snowfall should have preserved even the faintest movement, yet the ground lay undisturbed, pristine and unbroken. The children's clothes were untouched, their meals half-eaten, their beds cold. "No one walked out of here," Whitaker reportedly said. "It's like they were erased." The absence of logic made the case even darker. The staff, terrified and incoherent, provided fragmented testimonies. One caretaker swore she had seen Eleanor Voss in the chapel late that night, kneeling before the altar and speaking to someone who wasn't there. Another claimed she heard the sound of 12 voices singing from the forest, even though the windows had been sealed against the storm. Theories spread quickly. Some believed the orphanage had been the front for a cult, a secret sect that practiced ritual offerings. Others whispered that Eleanor had lost her sanity, lured by whatever dark presence lingered on the land. But there were those who believed something else entirely, something not bound by human cruelty. These villagers spoke of the returners, spirits of children taken by the woods a century earlier, drawn back by promises whispered through generations. They said the 12 orphans were not stolen, but chosen. Father Mallory refused to indulge superstition, but even he faltered after visiting the site where the circle of stones had been found. He noted that the snow inside the ring never melted, even in the sun, and that when he placed his hand over the ground he felt a faint vibration, as if the earth itself were breathing. He advised Whitaker to consecrate the orphanage, to have it blessed before more harm was done. The sheriff agreed, but before the ritual could take place, Eleanor Voss was discovered dead, her body frozen near the tree line, eyes open and fixed toward the forest. Her death ended the investigation as abruptly as it had begun. The state declared the case unsolved, attributing the missing children to unknown causes and closing the file within the year. Whitaker resigned soon after, citing unexplainable occurrences and refusing further comment. The villagers said he was never the same again. He stopped sleeping, stopped speaking of that night, and kept a single drawing from the orphanage hidden in his home. 12 small figures standing in a circle beneath a crescent moon, all facing the woods. In the years following the tragedy, the Black Hollow Orphanage was abandoned, its gates chained and its windows boarded. Yet the place never truly fell silent. Locals claimed that no matter how tightly the doors were sealed, the faint sound of children's laughter still echoed from the upper floors at dusk. The surrounding woods began to reclaim the structure, ivy crawling up the walls like veins, trees bending inward as though protecting or imprisoning whatever lingered inside. By the 1920s, the story had turned into a warning. Parents told their children never to wander too close to the hollow. For the woods remember names. Decades passed and Black Hollow's legend only deepened. In 1954, a group of trespassing teenagers entered the orphanage on a dare. Only one returned. half frozen and incoherent, speaking of faces in the dark and voices singing a hymn that ended mid-note. His account was dismissed as hysteria, but the sheriff who investigated refused to stay past sunset, saying the air inside felt like breathing through glass. The building was declared condemned soon after, though no official demolition order was ever carried out. It stood untouched, its reputation preserved by fear more than law. It wasn't until the late 1980s that historians and paranormal researchers, intrigued by the orphanage's persistent lore, convinced the county to allow limited access for documentation. Among them was Dr. Helen Morrow, a professor of historical anthropology who specialized in cultic practices of early America. She and her team expected dust, decay, and perhaps a few artifacts of curiosity. What they found defied simple explanation. Behind a cracked section of plaster in the east wing, they discovered 12 small wooden dolls arranged in a perfect circle, each etched with initials corresponding to the names of the missing orphans. The dolls were tied together with thin red thread, aged but intact. Beneath them lay a parchment so fragile it nearly disintegrated when touched. On it were written 5 words in faded brown ink. They were called, "Not Taken." Dr. Morrow noted the unsettling precision of the doll's arrangement and the strange preservation of the materials, despite decades of neglect. She reported the findings, but the archive copy of her report mysteriously vanished from county records. Months later, Morrow herself withdrew from public life, claiming she had developed recurring dreams of the woods and distant singing. None of her team ever returned to the site. Today, the orphanage remains sealed by state order, fenced off and surrounded by warning signs. Yet residents of nearby towns continue to speak of odd occurrences. Lights flickering deep within the forest, or the faint echo of a bell tolling from nowhere. Some hikers have reported hearing footsteps following them just beyond sight, or children's laughter that fades the moment they turn around. Each year in mid-January, locals gather at the edge of Black Hollow to light candles in memory of the 12 lost souls, though most leave quickly, unwilling to linger after dark. When the wind begins to whisper the same word carved into the orphanage wall over a century ago, returned. The gates of Black Hollow remain closed, its secrets buried under a century of silence. But every legend leaves echoes, whispers of other places where light was swallowed by the dark. If you still hear those whispers, follow them, because this isn't the only story history tried to forget. Subscribe, and step with us into the next forgotten chapter of the world's darkest mysteries.